far too long. Now, I'm going to record some of the panelists we have here. I sat in their sessions yesterday. Rick Grimm, for example, one of the interesting things, I'm going to quote. Remember, I was taking those copious notes. In his session, he said, procurement is too focused on compliance instead of empowerment. Sound familiar? Tim Cummins, in his session, said, following the rules in the quest for the perfect procurement. I like that term, perfect procurement, rarely produces the desired or best outcome. You see sort of the tone setting here? And he said, by doing that, and continuing to focus on those things which are not productive, not producing the best outcome, the things that we've been taught and trained to focus upon, means that 47%, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Tim, 47% of today's procurement professionals will become redundant. How do you feel about that? 47%, look at the size of this room. 47%, almost half, are going to be redundant. How does it feel to be redundant? Is this on? Hi. See, you know what? It's like in a restaurant. I saw you taking a bite and how your meal is. How does it feel to be redundant?
Well, actually, I'm not a procurement person. I'm just a business manager.
You see, look at this.
I'm going to be redundant.
I'm not buying a lottery ticket. The one person in a full room, and I figured you're not even here. Could someone please help me out here because I don't have my glasses on? Please tell me yours prepared. I'll still come and bother you anyway. What does it feel like to say that, 50% somebody at this table is going to be redundant? How does that make you feel?
Not needed.
Not needed. That's not right. But how could that be? Because we're at the verge of the most powerful point in our profession's history. Yet how can 47% of people not be relevant? And that's sort of the focus of this guest panel we're bringing together today. Bringing together international experts who I'll be introducing momentarily to talk about the power of procurement and how to leverage it. But one of the things, and Kate, you had a very interesting session this morning, let's start within the concept of being able to move in that direction. The Einstein quote. What was it? You can't solve existing problems by using the thinking that created them in the first place. So at the end of the day, the objective of what this panel is going to do, what we're going to focus on, is changing our thinking. Does that sound reasonable? I think that makes a whole lot of sense. And so to start, let's begin by welcoming our panel. And I'm going to start by welcoming Chris Sawchuk. Chris, will you please come up and take a seat here? Chris Sawchuk is a Harvard business since 1999. He started in business when he was 20, right, Chris? Yeah. And he's the firm's principal in global procurement advisory practices. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
The next I'd like to welcome is Kate Patassa. Kate, come on up. She's an author, educator, and architect of the Vested Business Model. She's a faculty lead researcher vested at the University of Tennessee Center for Executive Education. Welcome, Kate. All the way from, I don't know if you're overseas, you spend more time here than you do in the UK, but nonetheless, Tim Cummins is joining us. Please come up, Tim. He's the CEO and founder of the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management, otherwise known as IACCM. And what's funny is we've had a chance to talk several times, Kate and especially Tim, and this is the first time we're actually being able to meet each other in person, which is nice. Finally, last but not least, Rick Grimm. Rick is the CEO of the National Institute of Governmental Purchasing, or NIGP, and has been in his position since 1998. Rick, please go ahead. Now, one of the things, and we're going to start off on a fast start, but I want to set some of the ground rules here, is that we're going to be talking to the panel, we're going to be posing questions that we've gathered through research, through discussions, through feedback. But guess what? The fun part of all of this is you're all going to be involved in this, because I'm going to be coming out amongst the audience when you hear some of these answers to get your opinions. And it's no sense to hide or that, because I will see you. If you try to be inconspicuous, that's a sign for me, that's a red card. So better put your hand up and get it being ready. You, of course, not being a procurement, I've already learned my lesson. All All right, so now one of the interesting things is when we look at procurement, and generally speaking, I'm going to start off with Chris, the role of procurement professionals. How has it changed over the last 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's an interesting question in terms of how that role has been changing and needs to change, to be honest with you. One of the things that we did, earlier on, back in the 2007 timeframe, we talked about an evolving value proposition of procurement, and as it evolves, that value evolves in terms of what we do as a function. The role of the function will, and we as procurement professionals, we evolve as well. And so what we have seen is that this evolution from being an organization that gets the right stuff at the right place at the right time is also getting it at the right price, evolve into a function that is, more focusing on not only doing that, that's not going away, but also focusing on things in terms of, tapping into those capabilities that exist in our supply base, to be able to generate additional value that may be defined a bit differently than what we were doing before. So, one of the things that I find is that the role of the function evolves similar to the role of the value proposition of the function as well.
Okay, now this is an interesting point. I want to go to Tim, and then I'll go to you, Rick, and then, of course, Kate weigh in on it. 47% of the people are going to become redundant. So the role is changing. 47% is going to become redundant. Why is that going to happen? Is that because 47% just don't want to learn, don't get it? I mean, nobody out there wants to realize that they want to retire today or lose their job. Okay, well, you're an exception, of course. But why? Why would the change that Chris has just talked about, why will 47% make that change?
So, first of all, I'd like to point out to you that, of course, it wasn't my number of 47%, that came from McKinsey, so please don't throw things at me.
I'll just step back.
I'm not here with a whole load of redundancy notices, you'll be pleased to know. Why would that affect procurement when, as Chris is saying, so much seems to be headed in a positive direction? I think we have to look at that number in the context of not procurement specifically, but it was actually a comment about professions in general, and the fact that for many professions there is indeed a tremendous shift with the role of automation and technology that is going to continue to intervene and will, even in the field of procurement, represent substantial job losses for many of the tasks that are being performed right now. I think to your point, however, John, does that mean necessarily 47% of people lose their job? No, it doesn't. It means, however, that we have to rethink the role in a much more fundamental way, and certainly we have to move up the value chain. We have to address the point you were making at the beginning, which is what actually is the value of procurement in the sort of next 5 to 10 years. If I may very briefly, just picking up on Chris's point, the challenge I see in many ways is not a lack of possibilities for procurement, but I think as a community, as a profession, there's probably tremendous confusion about what that new role is. There are many new tasks which are emerging, which have real value. But in fact, if you go to one procurement group versus another, you will find it very hard to get a consistent picture of what they actually think the shifting role of procurement is. So I think one of the biggest challenges we face is actually that of clarity, of another discussion we're having. What does the brand represent?
All right, interesting point. Rick, I'm going to touch with you on a moment the difference between public and private sector procurement, but to set that up, let's look at it from a generational perspective. Robert Hanfield wrote a book called The Procurement Value Proposition, and he indicated the fact that unlike any other time, traditional or what you call the experienced procurement professionals are not going to make the transition over to the new way of doing business. In fact, he used the term, there is a definitive and definite break between past generation of procurement professionals and the emerging professionals from today. Not only in terms of getting it, but having an awareness and how the training occurs and how they view the mindset change. And we'll touch with you, Kate, on that mindset change shortly. Is that an issue? Is it a generational factor? And within that realm, after you answer that, Tim, Rick, How does that measure out in terms of the public profession? So Tim?
You're first. Oh, yes.
Whether it's generational.
Yes.
I think there's a degree of that, John. I think that's a reasonable observation. I was actually being challenged by one of my staff today who was making the observation that the average age of the team in IECCM is sort of getting somewhere into the 50s. It would be nice for me if it was still true. And was raising the question and said, you know, this was actually a commentary on the retention of academics. You're not there yet, but it was making the observation that much academic tenure, you know, there are many academics now into their 70s, and is this really good for academia, for learning, for innovation, for teaching? Are they not out of touch with the younger generation? And I think that is a very real danger, that we've got this dividing line between a very dynamic youth. I'll give you a great example. I was talking with this relatively new head of the GSA a few months ago, and he was observing that, you know, they're hiring into federal government a lot of really good procurement and contracts people, and they come through the door, and he said, you know, and of course the first thing they're told is, well, there's the federal acquisition regulations, go read them, and here are some sample contracts, go read those. And a horrified look comes over their eyes, and they say, but where's the video? And I think it is a real divide in that sense of just how creative we are. And this is important not only from the point of view of our personal efficiency and effectiveness, our ability to grasp and understand things in better and simpler ways, but I think it's also about our commitment. My belief in the future of healthy professions is that their role for the future is not about being old craft unions maintaining their secrets. I know ways to do things, I'm special. It's actually about using that expertise to enable others to be more efficient. And I'm going to give you one very simple example that I think comes to mind for me. 20 years ago, if you woke up in the morning feeling sick, you probably thought to yourself, should I go see a doctor? Today, you wake up in the morning feeling sick, and your first thought is probably to turn on Google and look at your symptoms. And that, I think, is a philosophy we need to bring to bear in the way that we think of our professional capability and expertise. How do we enable others to make better decisions and the right judgments?
In that context, right, is there a difference between the public and private sector? What you heard what Chris said and Tim so eloquently putting it, is there a difference? Is there really a difference between public and private sector procurement professionals?
Yes. Yes. No. Maybe. Does this one work? Is there a turn on? No, it doesn't. You set me up, didn't you? There is a fundamental difference, and I think it's the key aspect that overrides all of these issues, and that is that the mission of the private sector is radically different than the mission of the public sector. And for that mission kind of drives inherently some inefficiencies that happen in the public sector because of the demands for a kind of a political process, a transparent process, and a leadership process. So one of the things that we deal with, and I sat in Chris's session and he talked about innovation, and those of us that have been in the public sector go, that's great. Spending that time like Google does, 20% of their time at the workforce is talking about innovation. But if that is not the mission of the organization, and if the leaders within the organization don't see that as part of the integral part of innovation, then it doesn't get done. So all of us want to be innovative. We all want to add value. But if our bosses don't understand innovation, that our role is compliance as opposed to value-driven, it actually makes it much more difficult for us to raise that bar.
Okay, now, Kate, this is coming to you, because, again, building on what you had said, and again, quote, procurement is too focused on compliance instead of empowerment in your session this morning on vested outsourcing, a whole new approach. not a true win-win, not an adversarial, not one of power. Yet within the procurement realms of the public sector, is it safe to say that that power position, because of the goal for compliance, the goal of the perfect procurement, is more daunting than it is in the private sector? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's more daunting. I think that it's inherent in our nature that if we have power, we use that power. And unfortunately, sometimes that means we abuse the power. So I told the story before I was in academia, I worked for Microsoft. And, they're a big company. And so even though I'm a little person, I had a big hammer because of the company that I represented. And so I was able to go and through power and highly competitive situations, very tough negotiations, we were able to win a lot more than we lost. So my boss would say, a win-win, Kate, is when we get to win twice, right? And so then going over to work for Microsoft's largest service provider, my goals as a service provider were polar opposite. They were in conflict to my clients. So as a procurement agent at Microsoft, and it's probably similar to yours, one of my goals was purchase price variance. So if I was able, John, if I was going to negotiate against you and you sold me, a widget for $1 and I was able to get that widget next year for 90 cents, hallelujah, I just got a bonus, my company won, right? But you lost. Because what's your goal? Your goal is how much revenue you make and how much profit you make. So a win for me was a loss for you. And being in academia, you can step back and think, wow, that win-lose game, is that the right game to play? And it might be if we're buying pens, right? But if we're really looking at some of the more strategic things that we're trying to accomplish, I like to use the analogy of Mount Everest, right? So if we're trying to climb our own procurement Mount Everest, to lower our total cost structure, to have higher service, whatever it is we're trying to achieve, higher quality, the difference between today and what we want, I call that a desired outcome. And we have to buy the future and not negotiate over today. Because if I'm negotiating that 10 cents on the price, I might have probably missed the mark on the total cost of ownership. I might have missed the fact that value can be created outside of price. So we have to challenge ourselves to move to best value, total cost of ownership, and these are harder skills. You can say, why are some people not going to be here? It's because of the lack of willingness to want to learn the skills of the future and have the courage to say, I'm going to take a best value approach because I'm entitled to as the law, and yes, I may have a protest, but it's the right thing to do.
All right. Now, everyone, I've given you the advantage of hearing the expert opinions of the panel, so I'm now going to ask you the next loaded question. What does it mean to be powerful in procurement, based upon what you heard?
I wasn't trying to hide this. I didn't know what to say.
Instinct.
What's the question again?
You were close. I'm a woman. That's a long way to go.
Repeat the question.
Procurement is becoming powerful. It has the potential to influence. Listening to our esteemed panel's explanation of what the changes that are happening, what to focus on, what it means to be a procurement professional, and not fall into that 47%. Tim didn't say it, by the way, it was somebody else. 47% is become redundant. What does it mean now, based on what you heard, to be powerful in procurement?
I really couldn't give you that. I'll rely on my perceived colleague.
I feel like Mike Ellis on 60 Minutes here. Can you bring in a big bright light on? Come on out, Senator. You gotta tell us.
I'm not a procurement person. I'm a construction guy.
All right. Is there anybody in procurement in this room? Please. You went. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna keep on. Your hand was up. I noticed that. What does it mean to be powerful in procurement?
To be powerful in procurement would be to purchase what your department needs at a reasonable price.
Purchase what your department needs at a reasonable price. You guys got to remember this because I'm not taking notes. Yes, by the way, thank you very much. You see, she threw you right under the bus there. It's like the scuba diving analogy. You know, two scuba diving buddies go down, one sees the shark, stabs the other in the leg, and swims to the surface. You've heard that. Okay. You're looking at me and say, don't even come up to me. But I'm going to. Based upon what you heard, what does it mean to be powerful in procurement to maintain relevancy, based upon what we've just heard? Because, and the reason I'm asking this is because in the next section of the questions, we're going to see if we don't understand where our power lies, or what we have to offer, how can we serve stakeholders? Because we're going to focus on the stakeholders who we are going to influence.
Well, I mean, that's one of the critical things is understanding our market and our customers. And to stay relevant, we have to stay up with technology, being able to offer what they need in a pace with the changing times. You know, and in procurement, you know, everybody yawns. But we just have to stay on top of the changing times.
Okay. What do you think? Does that make sense?
I think to have as much knowledge as you can to be able to negotiate from a position of strength.
Kate, you heard that? By the way, I'm not wearing my glasses. I can't see any of you right now. I hope I'm looking in the right direction. So negotiate from power strength. Well, let me ask you this, based upon power and position. How do you avoid being part of the 47% that is deemed to be redundant?
You have to be flexible. You can't just go with those bidders.
And what does that require? How do you have to change? What needs to change?
Look for the value.
Look for the value.
In negotiation.
Okay. Panel, I turn it back to you. Just a few comments. Do you think they get it in the audience? I'm going to go to you, Rick.
I think it's done. They really hit on the major point, which I think is where the convergence is for this profession. And that is understanding that our role is no longer compliance. And compliance is really critical, okay? Because you've got regulations that occur in the public, so you have to follow them. So I'm not saying that compliance is not important, but if you stop at compliance, and you don't look at the opportunity to be strategic, to look at value, all the comments were right, spot on. How do I get the best value? How do I innovate? That's where we need to be. You know, a lot of people say to me, you know, my role in public procurement is to keep me out of the newspaper. I would say, absolutely wrong. Your role is to get in the newspaper, to demonstrate that you have value. Because once you create value, and once externally, outside of this room, but for the folks that you report to, whether it's a finance officer or a governor or a city manager, once they understand your value, you will influence the opportunity to grow as a profession.
Now,
until we do that, we've got troubles.
So influence is power, is what you're saying.
Influence is total power, absolutely.
What do you say, Kate? Influence, is it power?
I would say influence is power, and so you have to try to influence instead of use your strength, right? So there's a difference. You can attract what you need, or you can push what you need. And so what we're starting to see is people use information as power. Instead of withholding information, transparency. There is power in transparency because it brings truth. It brings a candid conversation. It brings facts. How can I get to total cost of ownership without really understanding all the information and the facts? So it's looking at the problem through a different set of eyes, through a different lens, to solve the problem rather than just buy something. Right? Anyone can go be a buyer. How do we use our influence and garner information to help us make the right decisions, maybe the tough decisions, maybe the courageous decisions, because as I shared earlier with the MDOT I-35 bridge rebuild, you know, it was in the news, both because it was protested, but also because they were able to get a bridge up under budget in 11 months with radical quality levels and innovations that had never been had before. And with that achievement came a risk that, yes, they used the best value process, and they could get protested, and they did. But it was that courage to say, I'm gonna challenge the status quo and seek for these better solutions versus a safe solution.
Okay, how many are familiar with the example that Kate cited? If you aren't, it's certainly available in the presentation slide. But that was a circumstance of crisis. They brought everyone together. Scalability is critical. How do you create scalability through change, Chris? I mean, that's really the thing. This worked well. It's a model, but is a model that Kate refers to scalable? And how do you make it scalable?
It's an interesting question, and I'm just thinking for a second in terms of scalability. And, I think as you look at, some of the questions you were asking before, as you think about an organization and all the things that we do, what you're looking at is that, in many ways, if you look at public and private, organizations, we're not adding headcount to the ranks of the procurement profession across the board. We see that. We've been, benchmarking this for the last 15 years, and we don't see that headcount coming in. And really, the only way to create scalability is we have to reallocate what we do. And so, if you talk about some of the activities that we're being discussed in terms of what we can do to get involved in, whether it's cost modeling, et cetera, some of these other types of activities, it's a shifting of what we do today. It's a shifting from, if we have 80% of our folks allocated to certain types of activities and 20% to, other more strategic activities, how do we change that balance? And in some ways, create scalability to do these types of things over time. And that's really what we have to do over a longer period of time.
So does that, Tim, position us to better serve as we go into the next phase of our stakeholders, who are our internal and external customers? What Chris is saying, what everybody's been saying, does it position us to actually do the job that we need to do to leverage our power? Because I want to frame it like this. Back in 2007, CPO Agenda Roundtable discussion, they asked top executives and said, who is the best person to run a purchasing department? And at that time, the answer was, you're going to love this answer, someone who doesn't have a purchasing background. Yep. Based on what we know, based on what we know, what are we doing now to change that? To move into our role, assume our role as influencers. The power that comes from influence. What do we have to do?
So, fundamental to power to influence are, of course, areas of unique knowledge, which includes access to unique networks, unique sources of knowledge. There's plenty of research that points to the fact that if we want to be viewed as critical members of the team, then we have to be bringing insights and knowledge that people cannot otherwise easily acquire. And that isn't just from our personal knowledge. Interestingly, a lot of it is about the sense of, do you have access to a network of expertise that others on that team don't have? Now, of course, the second part of it is that they actually feel that the knowledge you have is valuable. So, to pick up on the points that others have made, if the value that we're proposing is one of, well, we're compliance experts, don't expect to be on that team, because the rules is not what the team is after. So, John, I need to just go back for a moment, because actually, in the interest of open panels, I'm going to disagree a little bit with Rick on all of the comments he made about, is public procurement fundamentally different from private procurement? I think historically it has been, whether it should have been, debate, but it has been. But I would suggest that actually we are, to pick another word you use, seeing more and more convergence. So there are some fundamental factors if you think about instability. You touched on political instability, we all know about that, and there's plenty of it around. But actually in the private sector they're facing more and more instability too, geopolitical, political, technological. So we're all dealing in fact with instability from multiple sources. We're all increasingly dealing in fact with issues of ethics. Or you might feel that private sector is unethical. That's changing and changing rapidly, and procurement are at the forefront of actually overseeing that ethical revolution in the way that their companies behave. Regulation affects us all. It used to be the public sector had far more regulation and rules and public procurement laws obviously affecting it, but actually the plethora of rules now affecting many private sector companies is similar. And all of this is also driving the need for far more judgment. It means that whether we're public or private, what people are looking for is, are you exercising good commercial and business judgment? And finally, we're all of us dealing with this mantra of unending and more rapid change. So I think there's actually, as I said, more and more convergence in these roles. And what we're really looking at is a future that depends very much on our ability to be effective managers of complexity.
All right, now this is an interesting point, because you're talking about a shift, if you will, from a legislative framework or mandate to one of personal judgment, good experience. And is that a safe way to sum up what you're talking about?
Personal judgment within the context of rules. I mean, there are rules.
Well, absolutely.
There are standards, but our role is going to be to say when exactly do those apply, how do they apply, and how do we work with them, through them, and around them when appropriate to get to the right solution, whether that's a business solution or a political solution.
Okay, now I'm going to ask the audience this because, Kate, those rules, Rick, those rules, and based upon what you said in your section, it seems those rules are more inhibitive than they are productive. They seem to remove the ability to think and have good judgment and provide a protective barrier, if you will, of belt with suspenders mindset. Is that a fair statement? That somehow, especially in the public sector, we're bound by rules and regulation or avoiding being off the front page of the newspaper?
Yes, I want to jump in here. So the University of Tennessee was actually commissioned to do a large research project funded by the Department of Defense and the United States Air Force to study complex services acquisitions. And one of the things that really frustrated the DoD and the Air Force was that sometimes, why were some of these, for example, the GE 404 engine in the Navy, why was it so successful when the Air Force was basically buying GE engines as well? And it was frustrated. They're like, that can't be the same GE. Why is this the good GE and this is the bad GE? And as we start to develop courseware for the Defense Acquisition University and the Air Force, we began to roll out, and a lot of it had to do with how do you make good business decisions given the factors. And the contracting officers would literally come up to us and say, I'm incensed that our government would pay you, the University of Tennessee, to come in here and teach us this because you're not a commissioned contracting officer. And I have the FAR, and it says right here, we can't do what you say. And I said, well, General Nasiello and the head of acquisition actually has approved the courseware that we're teaching you. I said, so, but, we're not perfect, so maybe, show me where in the FAR it says we can't do this. And they dig it out and go, right here, da-da-da-da-da. It doesn't actually say we can't do that. And so over and over and over again, we saw that the best, the acquisitions on these more complex, and I'm not talking about buying commodities and pins, but the more complex stuff that needs judgment, the best ones actually used amazing commercial judgment within the law. And it was interpreting the law so that you could, the law says you can have best value, why don't we do that, right? And so it was that ability to have the squishy skills and not just the hard skills. And I think when you look at how our profession is changing, more and more things are becoming complex. I mean, IT, I talked to the guys from VITA, outsourcing IT, facilities, those are squishy. They're service-oriented, and we need to have judgment because I can't compare apples to apples to apples to apples from a pen, right? I'm comparing solutions that I need to have interpretation. And it demands a different skill set that we need to not only learn, but we need to learn to get comfortable with.
All right. You heard what Kate said. Have you been equipped to make good judgments? Do we have signs?
I think Bob just created a party here. He's ready.
These are procurement one of them.
You're, yeah, we got one. We got a winner.
Have you been equipped to make good judgments, or are you making decisions based upon the rules, the legislation? Do you ever feel that you make the right decision because of the rules, but it's the wrong decision in terms of outcome?
I guess I come from a different perspective. I come also from private industry, so I have a background in that. So I look at things with sort of a private industry skew, even though I'm in public procurement. So I have the ability to see sort of bigger picture. I have been empowered by my group to think outside the box and to break away from how we've always done it before. So I think they have trusted me to think outside the box, and it's been successful. So.
Okay, is this the exception to the rule, do you think?
Yes.
Is this, or are you seeing more of that happening where you're getting the freedom to make good judgment, or do you feel bound by rules and regulations?
Well, that's one of the issues with private sector or the public sector. I think the private sector has a lot of flexibility in how they approach business in general. But her point was that I don't think that we are given the skills that we need because it requires some knowledge in a lot of different disciplines if you're going to look at a best value approach on something that you may not have in your agency, in your organization at all. I attended the class on outsourcing, and the comment was made that MDOT didn't have the expertise on how to build the bridge. They went to the experts who knew. And someone had a very, what they thought was an innovative approach. Well, how does the evaluation panel know whether that innovative approach is going to work unless they have some background, some skills, some training in doing that kind of evaluation?
So in essence, you don't disagree with what's been said. The real issue is, are you being equipped to be able to adapt to that new reality? How about you? Do you feel?
Yes, I feel like.
I'd like that you say to the microphone.
Yes, I feel that we're being equipped to do so, and if we're not, we know, or we're being presented the tools and sources necessary to get that knowledge. And I believe we're all a team, and I believe that we call on each other when we need such support to help us get the job done.
Does everyone agree with that? You heard two things. We need some training. I believe we are getting training. How many feel they're being equipped for this new reality? Hands up. I got more hands when I asked people if they thought I was good looking. I mean, so here's a void.
I want to jump in for a second. I mean,
Okay.
the simple fact that you guys are here and you're being exposed to all of these different thoughts in the different sessions, I mean, kudos to the state of Virginia. Because how many of your counterpart states are doing this?
A valid point, because you've got to talk about it. I mean, we sat in on Bob's presentation, and there was this huge scope of information. There's all kinds of data there. As you look at it, there's a ton of information. How do you begin to filter that down? Well, you can't filter down what you first don't understand and grasp the breadth of the challenges, the breadth of what's going on out there. And that's the whole idea of this session and these sessions today. So well said. So generally speaking, I guess the answer in the context of Kate's response is that this is maybe the starting point for learning the new reality of procurement and what direction we're going. Let's go to the next part of it. Who are we really serving? Who are our internal stakeholders? Who are our external customers? Is that changing? Are suppliers as much an important customer to us as the people we're serving within the state? What do you think, Brett?
It's all, this point, yes. It's all of the above. And we have, at least on the NIGP level, said that you've got a variety of stakeholders that are involved in the process. It includes your internal customer, the user departments that you serve, but it's the citizenry that's paying the bill. It is the supplier community that you're creating that relationship with on a long-term basis. And I actually don't see a major shift in that. I think it's always been that it's a multifaceted stakeholder group that you're serving.
But is that recognized? I mean, one of the interesting things I heard in a recent interview was that a lot of the principles aren't ones that we invented ourselves. What did you call it? You called it codifying? Yeah. But now we're starting to recognize that. Why is it coming to the surface now? Why are these long-standing principles, the things that which Rick referred to, Chris, why are they now coming to the forefront?
Well, I think there's several things, and I think, why some of these principles are coming to the forefront is you think about, talking about best value, et cetera. Part of it is, how do we get best value out of this investment that we've made in this capability within our organizations? Part of it is defining what best value truly is. I think, going back to some of the comments before, part of it is getting us laser focused on, what our objective is. I think, we've talked about the difference between public and private, and Tim made a comment that, there's a convergence that is occurring. And I think, that convergence will occur around, what are we setting out to do versus setting out to follow a process, right? If you look at one of the biggest differences I find between private and public, or at least has been the difference in terms of how they approach things. And, one of the things they approach is, we have rules to follow, but we have an objective. And whether it's a cost objective, whether it's a total value objective, whether it's an innovation objective, whatever that objective is for what we're doing, that's what we're going to go through. That's going to be defined by our stakeholders, those that, care about the output of what we're actually doing versus following the process. And so it allows us to be more creative, et cetera. And I think what you were saying before is that we do have flexibility. And so it's changing our orientation a bit to be focused on the output versus on the steps and processes that we actually take.
So in the end, we should, Tim, and over to you, Kate, focus less on process or the perfect procurement and focus more on the outcome. Is that a safe way to put it?
I didn't say not to, not to be perfect, but okay.
Well, if I may, I'm going to sort of pick up and challenge again a little bit what was just said, because I think the point around fitness for purpose is absolutely fundamental to what we're talking about. I think where we started with the fact that perhaps one of the challenges of procurement right now is there isn't perhaps enough unified view of what that purpose is. But we then need to become real champions of that purpose, and I don't think we sit and wait for stakeholders to tell us. That is exactly the problem we've got. We've sat down for too long and waited for other people to tell us what to do. I think the real value, the real role of procurement is getting up and saying, this is what you need. All of us are critical of suppliers who respond to wants rather than try and drive needs. And the same is true for us. So we've got to become champions of that cause, and yes, process is important, but then we need to define, for example, what that process needs to look like, what form and shape it needs to take. We need to become champions of it, which means that we have to have the confidence to stand up and really have a voice. We need to start campaigning more visibly, as other professions do. We need, for example, to mount challenges to some of the rules that we see today as barriers. I think the whole concept of challenge in the public sector is stupid. I think it doesn't work. It's not suitable to a 21st century environment. We need to push forward what are the alternatives to a much smarter way of ensuring equity, ensuring balance, ensuring integrity. That, for sure, is not the smartest way. And there are some really good statistics around, for anybody who wants it, that demonstrate that point. I think equally, why do we continue to use the ridiculous forms of contract that we offer that nobody can understand? They're saying that these are critical vehicles for managing business risk, and then we create them in a way that's completely unintelligible to anybody who needs to use them. Why?
It was easier to take the old contract and just redline it than to throw it out
But doesn't that come down to rewarding the change behavior with results? I mean, how do you change that? I mean, Kate, with the Minnesota Department of Transportation building the bridge, process did not get in the way of the outcome. The outcome became the driving factor. How do you change that, right? And I'm talking to you because NIGP is an association, IACCM is an association. I mean, you're the source of knowledge. Chris, you're a source of knowledge and intelligence. You're a source of knowledge. How do you change that?
You know, it's the conversation I had yesterday is there's this corporate will that we need to change, and there's also the individual will to change. And the transformation is really, to your point, is that we have moved fairly quickly as a profession from kind of a clerical function, a back office function, where you just tell me the rules and I'll follow the rules, into a more professional strategic function where you are given that flexibility, that recognition to look at things differently. So we really have to change the mindset corporately of elected leaders, of the constituencies, the stakeholders that we represent. But really it begins right here. And to your point, I think it was exceptional. You are here because you want to change. You did not leave your emails or your offices so that you could have a good time. Now, it might have been a second or third priority, because I saw you last night. But the first reason why you were here is you wanted to make a change for the organizations that you represent. You wanted to learn a new technique, a tactic, a strategy. Kudos to you for doing that, because you got 700 people in this room who should leave differently than when they arrived on Monday. So that's where it's about will. It's about saying, you know, enough. I am tired of being, you know, the clerical function in the back office. I want to make a difference. And let me tell you, when we talk about generations, the new generations coming in place now are going to demand that they have purposeful and meaningful relationships. They will come and drive the public procurement and take our seats if we drive professionalism. And if we treat it as a clerical profession, we are toast, because it's going to take us over.
Okay. Now, everyone's going to great points. Let me ask you this question. Hearing all of this, being excited, being motivated, this is what it makes sense. What was that term that Waldo used? Pump it up. No, push it up. Push it up. How many hearing this agree this, but then also say to themselves, how am I going to actually make this happen? How many are looking and saying, you preach to the choir, but we don't have the means to affect that kind of change within our own enterprise? How many? Put your hands up. So there's a few. What do you do to empower people when they don't feel empowered, or they feel that that empowerment and that idea isn't going to be well received? Okay?
Yeah, I want to point to something that the Department of Energy did with Kaiser Hill for the Rocky Flats cleanup. One of the most successful government procurements. The GAO, it was just such a dreadful place. So think about it, 75 years to clean up the Rocky Flats Superfund site, 800 buildings, 6,400 acres, $37 billion. And they'd gone through 2 suppliers, so of course that was what it was going to be. Neutral third parties came in and said, this is just a disaster. How do we clean this place up? And they changed, they did the first ever performance-based contract with Kaiser Hill. And Kaiser Hill took 40 people, 20 management, 20 union workers, because, oh, by the way, part of the deal was they had to take over the union employees, right? Put them in a room for 6 weeks and said, tell me what you can do. And they came back and said, we can do this cleanup with $7 billion in 7 years. We think. We might not, but it's a darn sight better than $37 billion in 75 years. And they said that from that day forward, they would challenge that it wasn't that you can't, it's we can, but now let's figure out how. So I would argue that if anyone in the room feels like they have a constraint, they need to have the duty and the courage to raise their hand and say, I can do this, but here's a constraint, and how do we get over this constraint? Because oftentimes there's just a way around the constraint. And the constraint is in our head.
All right, interesting point. Going to the next stage of our discussion, change is inevitable. We can talk about being the right thing to do. We can talk about being the smart thing to do. But let me just cite some statistics here. While it was dealing with a private sector, it can also ripple through the public sector. A study back in 2007, which was re-verified in 2009 and 2012 by another study of CFOs, said less than 20% of CFOs consider the work of CPOs and their staff as having a very positive impact on competitiveness. On average, only 46% of CFOs feel that the procurement team has contributed to enterprise growth. Only 57% of CFOs feel that procurement contributes to enterprise profitability. Now translate that into the public sector. Do we have to change? Is it optional? Does that surprise you, Chris?
The figures that were cited, and you said how long ago was that?
Yeah, it was 2007 starting, but the 2009 and 2012 study actually had worse results.
Oh, worse.
Worse results.
That is surprising to me. I was not surprised, at least initially, prior to 2007. And again, I'm going to reflect on some things that had occurred in the private industry. In 2008 we had the massive downturn in the markets, and that certainly allowed procurement to, in many ways, in many organizations, to move forward. In terms of some of the impact they were having on organizations. As to where we see today, some of that has not receded at all. In terms of CFOs, I think this goes back to the questions we were talking about stakeholders in the organization, and understanding that stakeholders have different perceptions in terms of what we do as a function, and different perceptions in terms of, and desires in terms of what they want out of us. And so as we align, typically the financial community has certain perspectives around cost savings and cost reductions, etc. Whereas if we go to other constituencies and stakeholders within our organizations, they may have other perspectives in terms of what they want out of what we do. And so, at least from one perspective, understand that there's these differences that exist. I think, CFOs today, there is a difference between what they expect out of procurement and are doing, and the believability of what we actually deliver. And that may be causing some of the challenges in the perception.
Okay, so when the challenge is the perception, and let's go to you, Tim, then over to you, Rick, whose responsibility is it to change that? Remember, we started this whole thing. Procurement is powerful. We have to change our attitudes, maintain relevancy, else we will not be around. Who is responsible for shaping that opinion?
Me.
It's all Tim's fault. You know what I'm saying? I mean, like, it's like...
I think that professional associations have a fundamental responsibility to their members. If we're going to be representative of people, then we have to be powerful in our voice. But of course, we won't probably achieve it alone, and we certainly won't achieve it without the active support and enthusiasm of our members to then utilize the materials that we produce, the information and insights that we create, and actually use those as discussion forums and platforms. I think as a community we need to start asking far more questions. Why? Why do we do things the way we do them? We need to be far more courageous in going forward to senior management with the sort of data that's increasingly getting produced that demonstrates the cost of poor procurement. Turning the perfect procurement on its head, the point is that perfect procurement is, because it's a rather narrow section, as you rightly highlighted, is frequently undermining the right business outcomes. We know from our data, for example, that some 35% of contracts on average underperform by a significant percentage against expectation. When you make this, therefore, our credibility with the CFO, we claim these savings, I don't see it translated to the bottom line. But that's often because we've used the wrong contracting vehicle, we finished up with the wrong supplier because of the wrong criteria. We need to go to the root causes. We need to start challenging and driving that change and showing the insights that we have as a community that nobody else has.
Okay, to take that a step, Rick, I'll point to you on this. We've all followed the rules or by what we've been taught, haven't we? We didn't come into work to say we want to mess it up and have 35% of the contracts underperform. Haven't we followed the rules and structures that we've been taught all along? You know what I'm saying? If you've done it right and followed the rules, yet 35% of all contracts underperform, is it your fault?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that you're responsible for what you do, but I think you should be educated.
But are you receiving the right education? You know what I'm saying about this, Rick? It's the perception of what we do. It's a vicious cycle. How do you break that cycle? How do you change the cycle so that you're getting the right inputs to affect the change, to become influencers, to do what Kate was talking about in the vested outsourcing model? I mean, how do you go about changing that?
John, if I may just pick up on the 35%, because I don't want anybody walking out of here thinking that I'm sitting here and saying that 35% of contracts fail because of you. I'm not. The beauty of a lot of what our power is actually that by and large, failure is caused by other stakeholders or by breakdowns in the overall integration within the business. We're running very complex businesses with a lot of specialists. A lot of them don't make particularly good decisions. They're too narrow, they're too specialist. Often we're far too respectful of them. Oh, they've got an accounting degree. Oh, they're a lawyer. Oh, we better do whatever they tell us. Well, actually, we shouldn't do what they tell us half the time, because often they're wrong. They've only got part of the picture. Our talent, our value to the business is the breadth of what we see. And we have to have the confidence of that breadth. So when it comes to the 35%, frequently you're going to be able to point to the fact that it's actually breakdowns in project management or engineering or in poor pricing decisions or on the supplier's part. But the point is, we can become the people who are highlighting those repetitive issues and challenges and driving the business improvements that gets that 35% down to 20%, 10%, whatever the achievable percentage is. Best performing companies have that number at about 7%. Worst performing companies have it over 50%. Where are you? I have no clue. But probably more to you, and I think we need it.
Rick, anything to add?
I just think it comes down to the fundamental issues of shifting where we want to be. So you're talking about redundancy, and I think you're using it interchangeably, redundancy, relevancy. You want to influence. So if that's the end result, how do you get there? And if you've got blocks in the process, if your rules and regulations are blocking you, there's two things that need to happen. You're absolutely right. We have we have a responsibility as professional organizations to provide that leadership for you corporately so that you look at what is the right type of enabling legislation that will transition you from a clerical function to a professional function. That's our responsibility, to get that out to you, to share that knowledge with you, and then your responsibility, so we're going to shift the monkey on you a little bit, is that you have to have the individual will to say, listen, our big organizations are saying this is the way we should be writing legislation. It's A, we're doing B, we need to transition to A, because that's where leadership is taking place. So again, we have to take some responsibility for this whole issue of being relevant. We have to take corporate responsibility as organizations, certainly as professional societies, and individually you have to take responsibility to have that will to go to the, where the new directions are for the profession.
New directions. Kate, we were talking about the tipping point yesterday. How do you get to that point of critical mass to get these changes to happen? I mean, how do we move from, because these are all great words, they're great insights. Does anybody disagree with what you're hearing here? No hands there. So we agree in the direction. We agree with the principles that are being presented. Yet how do we get it started?
Yeah, I think success begets success. And so this is really sad, but when we were working with the Air Force and we were studying these very successful contracts that had created tons of value, very, very well known, we We go to those groups and they go, don't tell anyone about us because they'll just make us have more work because everybody's going to be coming and wanting to do it. We said, I just thought that was really sad in that we should want to be in the news positively. Those people who challenged the status quo, who were able to manage the stakeholders so effectively, that brought these skills that we need to really create a massive value, were almost penalized because they still had their day job and they had to do all this other stuff. Let's promote those guys to become teachers. Let's put them in the news and raise them up and say, wow, you were so amazing. Because I think success begets success. And once you start to see one do well, how do we do another and how do we do another? And that's one of the reasons why we spend a lot of time and energy on our case studies. When we first produced our first book based on our research, everyone's like, oh, great theory, it'll never work. And we wrote the manual on how to do it. Great theory, well, I'm glad you know how to do it, but that's just too far reaching. And until we had our third book, which was nothing but case studies, Procter & Gamble, Microsoft, Department of Energy, MDOT, we'll go, wow, that can work. And the number one thing I have as well, MDOT had a crisis, and that's the only reason it worked. Or within P&G, they said, well, real estate, that's different. Or, Jones Lang Saul, they're just special. They're that special once-in-a-lifetime supplier that you get. And in reality, it starts with our mindset and our ability to challenge and say, what is possible? I think it's Henry Ford said, you can or you can't. It's in your mind. So I love going back to that DOE statement. From this day forward, we're going to say we can, and if there's an obstacle, come and raise your hand. It's our obligation to tell us what's preventing success. So challenge the status quo. Don't be afraid to say, I can't get there because I've got an obstacle and I need a wingman or 2 or 3. And then celebrate those successes. Be in the news. Like, y'all, that should be a goal of your guys. Who in here wants to be in the news in a year for an amazing procurement initiative that you've created? Right? I mean, that's cool. And then now you become teachers. If you can teach what you did, then it's going to catch on.
So that becomes the scalability, or following Collins' flywheel concept, gaining small tractions and victories. So is it safe to say from a practical standpoint in terms of measuring value and equating your value, is to choose projects that are maybe smaller projects, easier projects? Are there specific starting parts or points that you can do to start gaining these victories? Because let's face it, if you go after a big, massive project, everyone's watching, there's added pressure. Does it make more sense to approach it practically and saying, let's get little victories along the way and be selective of which projects? Let's find those pockets of change and innovation, and then if you do, and they're successful, can it become scalable? I'll go to you, Rick.
Just very quickly, it's not about process, it's about results. So you all do RFPs. So when you've completed the RFP process, and then you've gone to whoever you're reporting to, like the CFO, go back to the CFO example, have you told the CFO, okay, we got the process done, and the awardee is X? Or have you said the result was a cost savings of Y dollars? Because that's where you're driving the influence. The CFO goes, oh wow, you followed the process, that's what I want you to do. But you actually went a different distance. And the result was that you did some cost savings. You got the best value. Our NIGB president says when you do that, that means, depending upon where you are in your mission of your organization, that means more textbooks for kids in the classroom. It means more vehicles that you can put on the road for the police department because you did your job. And it's not about doing your job with process. It's about result. That's what you have to celebrate. And you can do those in small increments. You do RFPs every day. Have you demonstrated that result to your bosses so that they go, oh wow, you are an influencing strategic body within this organization?
So in other words, unlike the big bang aspect of the crisis with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, you look for every long journey begins with small steps, small successes. Where within the public sector are those projects? Should they look? I mean, I'm asking this because where do you start? Because you like this information, it makes sense. Where do you go? How do you find it? Is it just in every general small RFP that you start? Or are there specific points of, let's call it, attack for this?
I think, John, as I mentioned before, we've just got to start asking new and different questions. If I can, I'll give you an example. It could have come from anybody in this room, but it didn't. We've just been doing some fairly deep research on performance or outcome-based contracts. Now, there's a lot of talk, a lot of interest in performance and outcome-based contracts, but actually relatively little widespread use. Do they make a difference? Are they worthwhile? Now, the organizations that we're working with that are asking that question are from marketing. Why? Why wasn't that a procurement question? Why are we not asking those types of questions that said, actually, do the vehicles we use to contract with our suppliers make a difference to those outcomes? And in fact, if you ask that question, based on the research we got, we've had over 250 corporations responding, and if you'd like the research results, we'd like to share them. Those results show absolutely it makes a very substantial difference to the quality of the outcome, which then, of course, gives you a very different sort of conversation you could be having with your executives that would talk about the benefits of looking at new and different contracting models as a good way forward. I think it's important to remember we are not alone with this. We touched on the fact that 47% is generic, it's across professions. And after the comments I've made about lawyers, you may be surprised that I actually talk with many of them, or that they talk to me. But they do, and we work quite a lot actually with General Counsel. And I was in a meeting with General Counsel recently, where the consensus in the room was, you know, the world is really changing, it's really sad, the way that we as lawyers are just no longer respected as we used to be. And these days, when we go in and give advice to our executives, they don't just respect our opinions, they expect us to have facts. But bear in mind, the same applies to us. I would suggest that very often we tend to go with opinions, with feelings, with suggestions that this rule is a good rule. We don't really know whether it is, and we need increasingly to start challenging a lot of those underlying assumptions, and we need to establish more in the way of facts. Now, I know that can be really difficult. I led global re-engineering projects at IBM. It's not the easiest of organizations to turn around, I have to tell you. At that time, it was 450,000 people. There were a lot of stakeholders, many points of resistance. And you can't get change without having some level of facts. But of course, it's very often difficult to establish the facts because you haven't got a baseline, you haven't got data collection. It's important often to remember that you probably have a better sense, both individually and collectively, of what's going on. In other words, if you haven't got facts, make them up. But make them up with wisdom and judgment. Make them up recognizing that whatever you have as a community is going to be a darn sight better as data and information than anybody else in your organization. So have confidence in your beliefs and your experiences and pool and share those experiences as much as you can. Test them with your colleagues. But build that fact base to be able to drive the agenda for change.
And is that the step towards getting relevance and coming to the seat at the executive table as everyone's talking about? I mean, is that the key starting point? I'll start with you, Chris.
The seat at the table. If you've been in the procurement profession for more than 2 years, the perspective around getting a seat at the table is quite prevalent out there, and I think it's a term that a lot of people utilize and doesn't, I wouldn't say always fully understand what it is. And here's my point. It was a point I wanted to make a little bit earlier. Is we actually put an article out about 2 months ago about 5 characteristics of world-class procurement organizations. It was covered by Forbes, 6 weeks ago, and there was 5 characteristics, and one of those characteristics that we looked at, and we just looked at organizations that seem to be performing quite well. And, one of the things that we highlighted is one of the primary characteristics was being a trusted advisor. And if you think about what that is, being an advisor, and what an advisor really means, you have a lot of professional services organizations out there, and you look at them, and the individuals that work with these organizations and how they interact with the companies and the clients they work with. We have to change our mindset. I heard a lot about changing mindsets in terms of how we think about our value, how we have to get focus on total cost, and in a lot of different ways. But for us to gain more relevance and to seat at the proverbial table that we all would like to get a seat at, I'm worried about that next week for Thanksgiving, but what does that really mean? And in many ways, it's not us getting the seat, it's getting invited to that seat. And it's like being a trusted advisor. People say, well, I want to be a trusted advisor. Well, you don't determine whether you're a trusted advisor or not. Your stakeholders determine that, whether you are to them. And so the question is, how do we become that? And so there's a lot of things that we have to do in terms of working to become that. And I would think that that would be something that most of us would aspire to be as we look forward in terms of our profession. Because once we get there and we're at that point, it's sort of like a function or a stakeholder that doesn't want to make a decision until they confer with you to say, what do you think before I make this decision? And I think once you get to that point, you know you've made it. And it opens up a lot of doors to have and create value, like we've been talking about, in many other ways.
So in essence, you evolve.
Absolutely.
Before we bring up, what are we doing for time, by the way? How long are we? Wrap it up, eh? Okay. You have time to go out there and ask 2 questions? Please ask me. Oh yes, I'm supposed to ask you to do evaluations to fill them out and complete them. And license number XY79, your lights are on. Okay, 2 quick questions from the audience, and what I wanted to do is bring up Bob Seaver. What have you taken away from this? What have you taken away from the discussion?
Well, I think that procurement is a complicated profession in a way. When you talk about the total cost of ownership, it's really hard to stop, if you buy a piece of equipment that's going to have a 5-year life period, maintenance and repair, you got to take all that consideration. There's a long time. Contract management, it's really tough because you're not able to be out there every day. Some of these big fail. I think we do need to use the rules and regulations to get the objectives that we have. That is a challenge. We're probably one of the few professions that get audited 2 or 3 years down the road. In the private sector, that didn't happen. When I made pyramids, bill distribution, no one came back 3 years down and said, did you do it right? Or in the government sector, you do. So it's a little bit more complicated. There's a risk and reward in taking chances. We don't have a lot of people here that bought the system that through the old regimes have lost their jobs. So there's a lot of risk in that. So when you go to take that chance, a lot of people have to worry about, well, am I going to get fired? So as they follow those rules, so there's a reason we're developing that. And you're right, you need the leaders. The leaders need to support you when you make a mistake to help you learn and to prosper from that standpoint.
I think that sums it up well. Everyone agree with that?
Yes.
All right. I just want to thank our panel today, David Pazik, Chris Gotcha, and it's always a pleasure, and Rick Grimm, thank you so much.